value addition. We must look at transfer of skills and technology. And so that is our expectation, that we will work in a different way with BRICS. And I'm glad that that's what I kind of heard this morning, in the opening session. So we are very encouraged. And ladies and gentlemen, the BRICS Business Forum that was held on March 13 in Durban, eThekwini, as one of the outcomes in a joint statement agreed that I just want to remind ourselves and quote, BRICS and Africa will forge a closer partnership for development, integration, and industrialization. BRICS countries will actively support infrastructure development and industrialization on the African continent in order to contribute to its development and to expand trade links between Africa and BRICS. Close quotes. So, premised on that, I think we are into a good relationship. We welcome the close partnership with yourselves as business persons from BRICS, because it has the potential to result, as I said, in a win-win situation. Returns on your investments on the African continent in virtually every sector, despite the global economic crisis, is better than many other destinations in the world. And unlike in the preceding decades, resources only account for 1/3 of the growth. The rest does include growth in other sectors such as wholesale and retail, agriculture, transport, telecommunications, bit of manufacturing, and financial and other services. Africa also has a growing and young population, as you can see. We're all young here. And a growing middle class. It therefore makes business sense to invest in the continent. And of course, already being more than 1 billion strong, and by 2050 being 2 billion strong, that's a huge market. And you'll be very brave to ignore it. And so we are, and of course it's a young population, and that's what makes a big difference. Energetic, willing to work hard, creative, innovative. We see where they've had the opportunity with cell phones to innovate. They've been innovating, and they are taking on the technology. They are now the second biggest market for cell phones. But maybe they should start manufacturing the cell phones as well. We have all the inputs that are needed. So why not manufacture them here as well? So we hope that working with BRICS, we will be able to see the first African cell phone. For me, it doesn't matter, African. If it's produced here on the African continent, that's very important. So foreign direct investments, including investments in infrastructure and agriculture and agribusiness in our mineral, energy and maritime resources, in our services and manufacturing sector, should therefore be accompanied by investments in skills and technology transfer, in beneficiation and local production. But also, we expect BRIC business people to behave slightly differently from others. We want them to be identified by paying fair taxes, creating jobs, small and medium enterprises, and through joint ventures with local African business. Because the study that was done by ECA and others, that shows that we are losing a lot of revenue from Africa. for a number of reasons. One, companies inflate their costs, undervalue what they take out, hide the ownership of the business through some opaque ownership network structuring, and as a result pay very little tax. So we don't expect that from our BRICS partners anyway. I'm just mentioning it. It's not referring to you, because I'm sure you won't do that to us. But we need also to work with those companies that do that to make sure that at least Africa does get what is due to it. It must get the proper taxes. We must develop expertise so that we can be able to determine how much people are lifting out of our countries. We must also develop skills and capacity to be able to see when the costs are overinflated so that we don't lose. So we're furthermore, in the context of the action plan of boosting intra-African trade, also paying attention to demand-side measures such as strengthening or the formation of trade and investment councils, sub-regional credit and insurance systems, sub-regional banks to finance production and trade. This is aimed at boosting intra-African trade, but will also help to create a better environment for investments into any country or region on our continent. This approach, we believe, will contribute towards African growth and development, which is in the interest of BRIC countries as well, because it will also mean the growth of the African market. In this context of strengthening Africa-BRIC cooperation, the African Union this year has visited China, Russia, to discuss how to take forward this partnership. We met with different government officials and also with business people in the private sector to narrow down the different sectors of common interest and practical ways to take forward business and other linkages. The African Union invites the BRICS business councils to partner with it in specific sectors, especially infrastructure, but also other priority sectors identified in the breakaway sections, to help bring together regional and continental groups to ensure that we move the partnership to a different level. Ladies and gentlemen, in the year that Africa is celebrating 50 years since the founding of the OAU and AU, we are also discussing Agenda 2063 as a vision to ensure that over the next few decades, we build a continent that is prosperous, integrated, people-centered, and at peace with itself. We are confident that this is possible and resolute to make it happen. The doors of the African Union are open for further engagements with you, and we look forward to hearing the outcomes of these deliberations. And whatever the AU can do to assist, we are happy to be the facilitators. And indeed, we hope that sometimes we can have these meetings, maybe different sectors of business people, at the headquarters of the AU. And you will be very well looked after, and we will mobilize all the relevant stakeholders on the African continent to meet with you. So, together with my brothers here, you are welcome. I hope to see you next at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. Thank you.
So now we have We have heard the wishes of the African Union, the wishes of the continent, what the continent expects from the BRICS and from all of us. And that warning, we Africans should not forget that Africans must invest in our own continent. In the breakaway session, I said that we Africans, we must watch not to look at the BRICS as the new colonizers, where we have to go to have recourse to them, to whatever we want to do. We say, no, we go to the BRICS. We go to the BRICS. No, we want the BRICS to come and find a base where to work by working with us, because we have got the initiative. Because we have now the raw materials, we have the brains, and today we can say we have developed brains. We have the land, and we have the manpower. We have all what is necessary to build a car, to build a tractor, but we are not doing that. Why? We should get an answer among ourselves, the Africans, so that we call the BRICS not as colonizers, but as partners. Now, I would like to now give the floor to Mr. Christo Weiss, a very top African business leader. I know, among other things, that the ShopRite Holdings have got a chain of shops in Mozambique, in Zambia, in Malawi, in South Africa, and maybe elsewhere, maybe Botswana, and so on. So it's a big chain which unites many countries in Southern Africa. I'm glad that when I provided the space where the ShopRite, the first ShopRite was built, I provided a space which is close to the Peace Square, and the ShopRite had to give us in exchange to fulfill the task of maintaining this Peace Square, where every 4th of October we meet to speak about peace. So this is the role also of the ShopRites. So, Mr. Christo, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, President Chissano, other dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, you may be somewhat surprised that you're being addressed by a shopkeeper at such an august meeting as this. But I am, in fact, a very grateful shopkeeper. My friend Patrice asked me very kindly to propose a vote of thanks at this occasion, which I do with great pleasure. I asked him to be a little bit more precise as to who all I should thank. And in his typical charming fashion, he said, Christo, you have carte blanche. You can thank whoever you want to. So if I may start, and I will be very brief, because I know that it's very dangerous for a speaker to get between his audience and their meal. Now, first of all, I think then, Patrice, having got the license, I would like to thank our partners in the BRICS constellation that they have woken up to the true potential of Africa. You know, and I particularly noticed that Dr. Dlamini Zuma said that South Africa, it's just Africa. One of the tragedies in our part of the world has been that for a very long time, also people within South Africa, did not realize that South Africa is an African country. Fortunately, we achieved many things in the past 20 years, but one of our major achievements is that everybody today fully understands that South Africa is an African country. Now, I know on the BRICS concept, there were and probably still are a lot of skeptics as to whether South Africa really belongs in that company. Now, I believe that those skeptics will be proven very wrong and in a very short space of time, because the skeptics underestimate Africans' belief in themselves and in their continent. And they look past the low-hanging fruit that is so abundant in Africa. There is one thing, however, which we should not lose sight of, in my opinion, and that is, as part of the developing world, and there's no shame in it, we will need help, and we should welcome help from other parts of the world, be it our BRICS partners or elsewhere. But one thing we have to do for ourselves, and that is change the very substantial negative perception that still exists in large part of the world in respect of our continent. That is something that we should not ask for help for. We are perfectly capable of doing it ourselves. And therefore, my next thanks goes to Patrice and his colleagues for arranging such a significant event as this, and to do it that it runs like a Swiss watch. Secondly, for all the people, obviously, who came from the co-BRICS countries and who helped, we thank them as well. Last but not least, our program director, President Chissano, who, as we've heard, was the first recipient and a well-deserved one of the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Good Governance. He is indeed an African of whom all of us should be proud. Our keynote speaker today, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, equally is one that makes us South Africans proud that we could make her talents available to our continent. And therefore also a very sincere word of welcome, of thanks to her. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you now enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
present in the chamber this morning when a statement prepared by Mr. Terry Crawford Brown was read. Might I just read a paragraph of that document and ask you to comment thereon? It says at paragraph 22, subparagraph B, and I'll paraphrase this. It is public knowledge, confirmed by the Minister of Defense and Veteran Affairs, that the frigates and submarines are inoperable, and that almost half of the BAE sub-Gripens have been placed in long-term storage because South Africa lacks the pilots to fly them, the mechanics to maintain them, and even the money to fuel them. Can I ask you to comment on that statement? Chair, it is paragraph 22, subparagraph B.
Chairperson, my comment on that is that that is not the way that I understand it. If the Minister had said that, then I'm not aware of the environment in which he made that expression. And I'm of the opinion that this would have been a resume written to indicate a certain shortcoming, rather than to understand or to express it in the way that I've attempted to express it, where we indicate that long-term storage is part of a process of utilization when you have to manage the life cycle of assets in terms of your resources that are available. That's my comment, Chairperson.
But from the Navy's perspective, is it factually correct that the frigates and submarines are inoperable?
That's incorrect, Chairperson. Inoperable means they are unable to operate. They certainly can operate and do operate and will operate. There will always be those that are in a maintenance cycle, and I think I've clarified that issue.
Thank you, Admiral. Might I then direct your attention to the portion of your statement that deals with the funding profile of acquisition of assets, and ask you to comment on that subject.
Chairperson, this part of the information that I'm providing, and I've been reminded I'm under oath, so I should read this because I'm not what they call a bean counter. I'm not in the financial environment, but I can share this. Because what I'm saying now is intended to provide an overview of the funding profile for the acquisition of military assets and, for the purposes of the Commission, the SDPP assets. I must emphasize that this does not include the allocation of funds nor the control of funds, but merely the concept of the flow of funds. How funds are controlled and allocated is another issue. The General Defence Account is part of the budget vote, and the DoD conducts its business as stipulated in the annual performance plan. I alluded to the annual performance plan, Chairperson, when I introduced my profile when I was a regular of the SANDF. The GDA covers three priorities in terms of the expenditure profile. That's the General Defence Account. So this is to give, Chairperson, you an understanding of how the available money is used for the utilization aspect that I've covered. Firstly, we have to pay our personnel. Salaries is the first priority. The second priority are honouring of contracts, and those are the day-to-day contracts that we have in place to run the SAND from a fuel contract, food contract to photostat contracts. Not personnel contracts, they've been covered. What is left over out of the General Defence account is discretionary funding for operating the DoD. This includes, in terms of priorities, first of all, out of that's left, the priority there is to rise the government's audit commitments to a person. And to be able to do that, one must prepare forces. And then for the employment of forces, fortunately, sometimes we get a remuneration from an entity in terms of ad hoc activities that we engage in. So that is merely to indicate that out of the General Defence account, the operating funds are really restricted, and this will influence the utilization, that life cycle management. So in other words, the way that I'm expressing it is saying that we utilize our assets in the life cycle management in terms of the funding that's available. And if this is perceived to be underutilization by some, then so be it. Within the GDA, funds are divided into Folio 1 and Folio 2. The GDA Folio 1 funds are those funds that have to be spent within the financial year. Otherwise, they are forfeited and returned to Treasury. In the General Defence account, Folio 2 funds may be rolled over to the next year, and they need not necessarily be returned to Treasury. An example of Folio 2 funds would be a vessel that the maintenance would cut across 2 years. The maintenance of a vessel that would be over a 2-year period, because that's operating. Because the next thing I'll get onto is the Special Defence account. So to ensure that the maintenance in operating can flow over 2 years, funds are allocated in our Folio 2 section of the GDA where we can roll it over and don't have to give it back. Meaning that those funds couldn't be used for anything else. And that was controlled by the Treasury and audited by the Auditor General, who incidentally audits all of these accounts. The GDA, the SDA, and the ring-fenced SDP funds. For the execution of the SDP contracts, funding from the SDA was required to cover certain project costs, such as administration costs for project officers, as opposed to the actual cost of acquisition of the hardware. Chairperson, this is just to indicate that even although we get funding specifically designated for the packages, funding had to come out of the SDAs to cover some of the administration type funds that required to run the project. So that ring-fenced money was spent on the hardware, not on project operating funds. These accounts, the GDA, the SDA, and the SDP ring-fenced accounts, were appropriated through the defence vote and reflected in terms of the medium-term expenditure framework. The medium-term expenditure framework is that part of the appropriation that indicates to us what the defence vote gives for a financial year and the 2 following years as an estimation. The medium-term expenditure framework covers a 3-year period, but the only amount that is actually useful is the year for which it's designated. The 2 outer years are merely an indication of what one could expect. And our experience is that every year that changes, generally to our detriment. The MTEF is the instrument indicating the expenditure framework for the execution of the medium-term strategic framework of government. So the MTSF is that plan that I spoke about over a 5-year period, determined by the priorities of government in that administration, and the MTEF, which is published every year through the defence vote, that appropriation allows us to execute year by year in each of those 5 years. The MTEF expresses the funds that are available as indicated in the vote, as well as the 2 ensuing years. The ensuing years are an indication of what may be expected to appear in the vote for those years. The vote is an annual appropriation and before the funds reflected in the MTEF for the ensuing years would not necessarily be what is ultimately reflected for that actual allocation for those years. So once again, this has an effect on the utilization, because utilization may be planned in terms of a certain funding profile, and if that funding profile is less than anticipated, then one would then argue that you would have to reduce your utilization cycle. This indicates that planning in accordance with the MTEF has to be reviewed every year, depending on that allocation. The distribution of DoD funding within programs, and by programs I mean like the Maritime Defence Program, Landward, Airward, is based on historic data as well as inputs made by a evaluation committee that deals with defence planning and budgeting. And that committee has not, during my year in the SAND, been in a position to take funds from one environment and put them into another environment, because there's generally not enough to take away from one and give to another. One has to plan within your allocated budget. Therefore, Chairperson, that utilization is planned on what we are allocated. Thank you.
Now, Admiral, just to summarize your evidence that has been adduced today with regard to the SDPs, we would sum up, and please correct me if I'm wrong, as follows. With the coming into operation of the new constitutional dispensation, the country came out of isolation, and through a public process that was largely participatory and participative, the outside world became aware of the need of the South African National Defence Force. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at the time of the defence review, or firstly during the process of the white paper, which was followed by the defence review, the need of the different arms of services was also identified. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chairperson.
identification of these needs and the policy documents that inform the acquisition, is it correct to say that the other competing interests, such as the RDP obligations that government looked into, were also considered, and the exercise then was informed by a balancing act between competing interests on the obligations of government?
Chairperson, that is correct, but I need to reiterate that that is a process beyond the DoD. That is a government decision. I must make it very clear that the role of the DoD is to present the requirement. The decision as to how much funds were allocated to one environment and to another, that is done at the national level.
But would you agree that the obligation to balance the competing interests was a matter that was identified in the white paper?
I agree to that.
Now, once the need had been identified, these packages were found to be necessary to rejuvenate, amongst other things, the Navy and the Air Force. Is that correct?
That's correct.
This was necessitated by the mandate on the SANDF as described and provided for in the Constitution. Agree?
I agree, Chairperson.
It is these needs that subsequently informed the decision to acquire the package.
I agree.
The packages so acquired in terms of the STPs, as you have recently testified, are utilized in accordance with the mandate and budgetary requirements of the Department of Defense. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chairperson.
Is there anything else you would like to testify to with regard to the issues I have raised, which I may not have raised?
Chairperson, I'd just like to once again advise you, sir, that the detail that you may expect from me will be provided by my colleagues, and I'm sure that they will do that in a handsome way. Thank you, sir.
Just before you conclude, there is one matter I would like to raise with you, which comes out of the submissions, or at least one of the submissions that has been received by the Commission. And this matter is extracted from a supplementary submission that was made by Mr. Terry Crawford Brown to this Commission, in which he refers to certain statements that he alleges were attributable to you in your capacity as head of strategy during November 28, 2012 in Parliament. And the statement attributed to you includes the following matters that it is alleged you would have stated. Firstly, that there are 4 frigates, 3 submarines, 7 aircraft which are functionally useless. B, that the Air Force did not have sufficient funds even to keep the BAE Hawk and BAE Sub Gripen aircraft in the air. And C, that it is public knowledge that the 3 submarines were not being used because they required repairs after various serious mishaps, the suggestion being that the wrong engines were fitted into the frigates and will have to be replaced at huge expense. Now, are you aware, or did you at any stage make such utterances?
Chairperson, I'm not aware that I made any statement like that. I would have to consult the transcripts to ensure that what has been reflected there is the truth. I can say very confidently that it's not my style to make statements of that nature, particularly if the date is reflected as the 28th of November, which was on the evening tide of my 42-year career in the SANDF that I've served loyally, to make such damning and irrational statements. So if I'd be allowed to consult those transcripts, because I'm not sure if it says I was in Parliament. I'm not a parliamentarian, and nor do I attend any parliamentary function. What I do attend and where I do present the annual performance plan or the annual report is to the Oversight Committee, being the Portfolio Committee on Defence, where I present the facts in a very positive way as they're reflected in that report. So if you'd allow me, Chairman, then I would need to consult with my counsel to find out where that information comes from and how it could be validated and proven that I would have made utterances in such a derogatory manner. So,
thank you. Admiral, the Commission is not in possession of the record of those proceedings, but will endeavor to obtain them. But having said that, what do you make of the statement, among others, that the 4 frigates, the 3 submarines, and aircraft, or certain aircraft, are functionally useless, just as a matter of fact?
Chairperson, as a matter of fact, the 4 frigates, the 3 submarines, and all the aircraft that were acquired through the SDPPs are functional. And as I've said before, there may be some who are functional at different levels of functionality. In the Navy, we express the level of utilization of our vessels in levels of functionality, where we have a basic level and a seagoing level, an operational and a fully functional. And in the Air Force, we express this as states of readiness. And that's why I found it very odd that I would have ever said anything like that. It's not my language, and it's not something that I would be party to. So I would make it very clear that these vessels, the submarines, also vessels, and the aircraft are functional in various states of maintenance.
What do you make of the fact or the allegation that the Air Force did not have sufficient funds even to keep the BAE Hawk and BAE sub-Gripen aircraft in the air?
I would like to refer to the section of the annual report of 11/12, where in terms of fighter aircraft, because in the annual report we report on the program. So within the air defense program, one would find the Gripens and the Hawks under the heading of fighter aircraft. And there we'll see that the performance to plan was far in excess of what was planned. And the reason for the overachievement is given in that document. I don't have it with me, but I can certainly provide the reference to that and the reason why the overachievement was attained. So it's very difficult for me to understand that we couldn't even keep them in the air when we in fact overachieved our planned target.
Could you please give the full reference to the annual report that you are referring to for record purposes?
That would be the annual report of the South African National Defence Force for the financial year 2011/12. It's a public document and it should be available.
Now, lastly, what do you make of the allegation that it is, or it was public knowledge, that the 3 submarines were not being used because they required repairs after various serious mishaps? The suggestion being that the wrong engines were fitted into the frigates and will have to be replaced at huge expense.
Chairperson, once again, that statement is not very clear to me. I understand the difference between a submarine and a frigate. So if there are 3 submarines that have got the wording there in terms of not being able to function, I don't believe that's true. But how the reference then to the wrong engines fitted to a frigate would relate to a submarine, I don't understand. So this gives me the concern that that statement isn't a logical statement, but it's certainly not the case. That the wrong engine could be fitted into either a submarine or a frigate. The fitting of an engine is for that engine and no other engine. Otherwise, a huge amount of other modifications would have to be done. And I know that there's no engine other than the engine that the frigate was supplied with, that it was fitted. And during repairs, if that is going to happen, then that may or may not happen, depending on how a particular engine will have to be repaired. So that particular statement seems to be mixing submarines and frigates. But the truth of the matter is that there are 2 submarines that have been operational. Actually, 2 on the same day were at sea. And as I've explained, within a cycle, we've used 4 frigates. That's also reflected in the very same annual report. So these statements certainly would require some interrogation and validation in their damning form.
Thank you, Admiral. Chair, Commissioner Musi, that is the evidence of this witness.
Mr. Chairman, may I comment, please?
For record purposes, can you tell us your name?
Yes, I'm Terry Crawford-Brown. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The reference to Admiral Green's report to the Parliamentary Committee is given in the submission, the supplementary submission I made.
Just hold on, Mr. Crawford-Brown.
Yes.
What are you doing? Do you want to cross-examine or what do you want to do? Because I don't think at this stage of the proceedings I'm going to allow anybody just to make a statement. Unless if you stand up in order to cross-examine the witness. Otherwise, I would ask you to keep your comments until at a later stage.
So for the benefit of the Commission, I would like to make a point of clarification regarding Admiral Green's report to Parliament in November last year. And the reference to that is given in my supplementary submission of December last year. And it's all...
Just so let me try and find out from the evidence leaders. I thought the procedure is that once a witness has testified, that witness can be subjected to cross-examination and, if necessary, to re-examination by the witness's legal representative. I thought that is a procedure laid out in the regulations. I'm not quite sure if what Mr. Taylor Crawford Brown wants to do is part and parcel of what we're supposed to be doing at this stage. My view seems to be that if at all Mr. Taylor Crawford Brown wants to comment, he can do so at a later stage when he gives evidence or when he makes submissions at the end of the formal tendering of evidence by witnesses, unless if my understanding of the procedure is incorrect.
Chair, my understanding of the procedures as set out in the regulations coincide with yours. And it is not apparent at this stage that Mr. Terry Crawford Brown wants to apply for an opportunity to be allowed to cross-examine this witness, or whether he simply wants to make a comment which is not contemplated in the regulations.
Before you make a comment, Mr. Crawford Brown, I'm sure you were listening what I said and what Advocate Sibeko said. What do you want to do now? Where does it fall?
Sir, I wish to refer the Commission to the reference, since Admiral Green disputes that he made such a report to Parliament's committee. I wish to refer the Commission to the reference so they can check that. As regards cross-examination, I'm here to represent myself because my advocate was unable to be here because of other business. So when it comes to an application for cross-examination, I will leave that in the hands of my lawyer rather than myself.
Maybe in that case, you just defer your application for cross-examination to the time when your advocate will be available. But then, I think even at that time, even the application from your counsel will have to fit in with our arrangements, because we have certain arrangements, certain witnesses have been subpoenaed. When your counsel makes that application, I'll have to keep that in mind. As I understand it, you do not intend cross-examining because you're waiting for your counsel who will come at the later stage to make an application to cross-examine. Is that my understanding of what you're saying?
That is fine, yes, sir.
Besides that, is there any other person who will want to cross-examine the witness? Admiral, thanks a lot for the evidence that you gave. I'm sure it will go a long way in helping us to understand exactly what happened in this package and how the equipment is being utilized. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chair.
I beg your pardon, Chair. I am not certain if the legal representatives of the Department of Defense would like to clarify any of the matters that the Admiral has testified to during his testimony, in which event our colleagues led by Cooper SC would be entitled to be examined.
I'm sorry, maybe I guess what I should have done before I thank the witness.
The position is I would like to clarify one or two small points of detail with the Admiral report. Admiral Green, in the course of giving your evidence to the Commission, you explained that in your view, the equipment that was acquired through the SDPP package was modest when seen in the light of the need to rejuvenate and the need to update. And I want just to ask you to expand in a very general way in regard to that but the area in which I'm going to ask you to amplify your answer, I don't want to trespass on anything that Admiral Hicks will be saying. The area in which I would ask you to amplify is in regard to South Africa's maritime jurisdiction. And in that regard, I'm asking you to speak to that area of the seas over which South Africa is recognized to exercise a sovereign jurisdiction, and also over that area of the seas in which the economic interests of South Africa are generally recognized in international law. Now, in regard to that maritime jurisdiction, I would like you to give the Commission some idea of the size of the maritime waters over which South Africa has a special jurisdiction, both to serve and to protect.
Chairperson, the maritime jurisdiction is huge. Is huge. In relative terms, the maritime area is 3 times that of the landward area. Therefore, one would, I won't say generally, but for those of us that understand that business, the importance to have a deterrent when you have to defend an area like that in terms of your economic interests, because that area talks to the 12-mile limit, the national waters, and then to the 200 nautical mile economic zone, the extended economic zone within which we find our resources, our marine resources. So bearing in mind that that would then be a huge area, my utterance about a modest core force refers to the practicality of really covering that area with 4 frigates and 3 submarines. Now, what makes it achievable is the fact that the submarine is the greatest deterrent in the maritime environment. And that's where I refer back to the balanced force. That balance between the frigate and the submarine, and the frigate, that it can have a meaningful time at sea in that expansive area, is important, because in the options we would have seen that in some options there were no naval components. And if you don't have a submarine, then how many extra frigates would you require to provide the deterrent that you can protect and defend in a defensive posture? So that is why I referred to the modest the modest force design, and my council has asked me to focus on that maritime environment. So that is the reason why the vast coverage that's required, and therefore to do it with 4 frigates and 3 submarines is considered to be modest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Admiral, again, thank you. You are now finally excused.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Chairperson, it's our turn. Myself and Advocate Ngobese. Up to so far, you and the Commissioner appreciate the fact that the 4 of us sitting here are a team, Department of Defense witnesses, including our other two colleagues, Ms. Ramahaha and Mpaha SC, and Mr. Sibusiso Zondi. Our colleagues are done with Admiral Green. It's our turn now to lead Admiral Hicks, and we are ready. Permit me to say we would like to utilize this time of the day to lay a foundation in our leading of the testimony of Admiral Hicks. I do not know whether you would prefer an adjournment. We are in your hands, but be advised that we are ready to start leading that evidence.
Maybe let's take a 10 minutes adjournment, and when we come back, then we'll start with that witness. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, I'm going to give your computer back to you now. I'm just fighting with Amanda. It's cool. So I just missed this.
Oh, I was like, don't panic. It's fine. Just
panicking. Just because I just missed all the stuff. Well, I'm trying to live tweet it and do the thing and write the story. Because Adrian messaged me, he's like, we need a story right now, quick as you can. It's got to be about this, this, and this. So I'm like, it's actually not what I was going to write at all, but okay. So I write the story for them, and I send it through, and Amanda replies, she's like, hey, thanks for this, but we've already got a story like this from Sapa, which we got earlier, because then that's the thing, you compete with Sapa.
So rather focus that you were going to write.
Rather focus on doing us a decent rap later, and focus on the live tweeting and stuff. So I sent her an email back. I was like, okay, thanks. You know, it's just that Adrian did demand a really quick story from me, and also Tabelo and I are sharing like an internet connection, and it's quite tricky to live tweet and like take notes and pay attention and find stories.
Air tanks, which is a fundamental in a submarine of that nature, where the submarine would have to virtually be cut to pieces to replace that, and that then clearly indicated that those vessels were coming to the end of their useful life cycle as well. And the last submarine was decommissioned towards the end of 2004.
You
also referred in your testimony to the vessels known as the strike craft. What were these used for?
The strike craft were the only combatants that we had once the frigates were decommissioned. We had 9 strike craft, of which at best we could have 6 at sea at any one time, but normally we would have had less than that. And these ships of 400 tons were primarily designed to operate in a need arise. That is why we come to that expression for public understanding to say this is the insurance policy.
Now, I understood your evidence earlier to
issue. The General Defence account is part of the budget vote, and the DoD conducts its business as stipulated in the annual performance plan. I alluded to the annual performance plan, Chairperson, when I introduced my profile when I was serving, when I was
asking you to speak to that area of the seas over which South Africa is recognized to exercise a sovereign jurisdiction, and also over that area of the seas in which the economic interests of South Africa are generally recognized in international law. Now, in regard to that maritime jurisdiction, I would like you to give the Commission some idea of the size of the maritime waters over which South Africa has a special jurisdiction, both to serve and to protect.
Chairperson, the maritime jurisdiction air tanks, which is a fundamental in a submarine of that nature, where the submarine would have to virtually be cut to pieces to replace that, and that then clearly indicated that those vessels were coming to the end of their useful life cycle as well. And the last submarine was decommissioned towards the end of 2004.
You also referred in your testimony to the vessels known as the strike craft.